Throughout history, reports of mysterious lights, bizarre encounters, and unexplained phenomena have left us wondering what might be lurking beyond the stars. Today we'll be going through this creepy alien iceberg and exploring various extraterrestrial encounters. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tier 1. Alien Octopoids. In the early morning of August 16, 1968, a farmer in Spain experienced a bizarre encounter. This farmer, John Matu, woke up around 6 a.m. at his rural property located approximately 4 miles from Tavisia in Tarragona province. As he stepped outside to feed his cattle, he noticed an unusual light in the distance. At first, he mistook it for the reflection of a car and believing someone might need help, so he called out to his wife before heading toward the source of the light. He was accompanied by his dog and moved closer, becoming increasingly confused as the light failed to resemble anything familiar to him. Eventually, he knew that the source of the glow was not a car, but an ovoid, self-illuminated object that he linked to a half-watermelon, hovering roughly 4 feet above the ground. He stood by the luminous, dome-shaped craft. His attention was drawn to movement on the far side of the object. There, he spotted 2 creatures that he later described as resembling lightly colored octopuses. These entities were small, standing just over 3 feet tall, and moved with surprising speed. They were roughly 330 feet away, yet to clearly make out their tentacle-like appendages, which seemed like there were 4 or 5 of them. The farmer described their appearance as repulsive and alien-like, suggesting a form unlike anything that we know here on Earth. These cephalopod-like beings quickly retreated into the hovering object, which then flew up into the sky and disappeared. The experience left Matu so overwhelmed that he fainted, lying unconscious for an unknown period. His dog, who apparently was unaffected, remained by his side. When Matu finally returned home, he was unharmed but disoriented, and his memory of the event remained vivid. Matu's brother Sebastian, who was an accountant from the nearby village of Darmos, reported that Matu had been missing for nearly a full day. Sebastian suggested that Matu may have experienced missing time, which is a phenomenon often associated with alleged alien abductions. While his exact whereabouts during this period are unclear, some have said that he may have been taken aboard the craft and subjected to further interaction with these beings. In the days following this incident, Matu and his brother discovered physical evidence supporting his account. Beneath the spot where the UFO had hovered, the grass was scorched in a circular pattern. Also, 2 other similar burn marks were found nearby, appearing to be older but still of comparable size. Although no formal scientific analysis was conducted, there is unusual electromagnetic effects reported at the site. Both Matu and Sebastian noticed their watches stopped functioning whenever they approached the scorch marks, a phenomenon that's linked by an Austrian couple camping in the area. The man, Hans Volker, claimed to have taken photographs of the marks, though these images have never come up. The story gained public attention when Sebastian wrote a letter to the editor of the Barcelona Tele-Express on August 27, 1968, describing his brother's encounter. This account was later published in the Flying Saucer Review, special issue number 4, bringing the case to the attention of UFO researchers. The region around Tavisia became a hub for investigators, journalists, and curious viewers, who are all eager to uncover more about this unusual event. But despite their efforts, tracking down Matu is difficult, as Sebastian had not included a return address in his letter. The Barcelona-based Center for Interplanetary Studies, CIS, eventually became involved and attempted to locate the farmer through a public notice. However, when contacted, declined to provide further details, stating concerns about his and his brother's reputations. A paranormal investigator, Julio Roca Mutanolo, also examined the case, proposing that the Tavisia region was a hotspot for mystical and extraterrestrial phenomena. He claimed to have discovered a magic cave in the area, which he believed allowed access to alternate dimensions. Mutanolo also suggested that the magnetic disturbances caused by the UFO had led to the crash of a Piper Club airplane near Genista. While the wreckage was reportedly found, there was no definitive connection to the UFO. Now, amidst all this, journalist Alex Boots claimed to have located Matu and interviewed him at a local tavern, but by this time, the narrative had become so full of speculation and competing claims that some researchers dismissed this case as a hoax. Veron Aliens. In the late afternoon of September 27, 1989, an event occurred in a public park in Veron, Russia, involving what we know as the Giants of Veron. This incident was reported by multiple witnesses, including children and adults. Witness accounts described the sudden appearance of a large, glowing red object in the sky, which descended into the park, drawing the attention of a group of pedestrians. This craft was described as a distinctively round and luminous vehicle, and 3 humanoid figures emerged out of it. These beings were reported around 10 feet tall, with their bodies covered in metallic jumpsuits and shimmered under the light. Their heads were small and dome-like, they lacked conventional facial features, and had 3 glowing eyes that radiated a menacing light. As the crowd watched in awe and terror, a boy in the group cried out, overwhelmed by fear, and this led to an unsettling response from the entities. Without any visible movement or use of a device, the beings reportedly paralyzed the boy simply by looking at him. The moment sent a wave of panic through the witnesses, as the power of these creatures was pretty disturbing. After a brief disappearance, during which both the beings and their aircraft seemed to vanish into thin air, the giants reappeared just as suddenly as they had left. This time, their actions were more aggressive. According to reports, they emitted a beam of energy toward another boy who appeared to disintegrate in front of the spectators. Now, with the nature of the event, it left all the witnesses in a state of shock. Despite the violent and terrifying display, the beings didn't stay for long. After what seemed like a casual stroll through the park, they returned to their craft, which quickly ascended and disappeared into the air. As soon as the craft vanished, the boy who had been vaporized reappeared and unharmed. This detail, while offers relief to those who were there, only makes this event that more confusing. Now, the lack of consistent details and elements of the story leads to widespread skepticism. Some suggest that the incident was a hoax, concocted either by the children or just media, while some propose explanations like mass hysteria and pointing to psychological effects of the late Cold War era and cultural fascination with UFO phenomena during that time period. The Roswell Incident. In the summer of 1947, during the early days of the Cold War, something strange occurred near Roswell, Mexico. A rancher named W. Mac Brazel found debris scattered around his land about 75 miles north of Roswell. He took some of it to the local sheriff, George Wilcox, who then contacted Colonel William Blanchard at the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, RAAF. The next day, the RAAF shocked everyone by announcing they had recovered a flying disc. Now, this was a big deal and the story quickly spread, but within 24 hours, the army changed its attitude about this. They said the debris wasn't from a flying disc after all, but was actually from a weather balloon. Now, to back this up, they released photos of Major Jesse Marcel and an officer holding pieces of what they claimed was the balloon. For years, many people didn't believe the weather balloon explanation. Now, decades later, in 1994, the US Air Force admitted that the weather balloon story was just a cover-up. They said that the debris from a secret project called Project Mogul. This project used high-altitude balloons with microphones to spy on Soviet nuclear tests. Because it was classified at the time, they couldn't tell the truth about what really was going on. There were also rumors about alien bodies being found at the crash site. In 1997, the Air Force explained these stories by saying they probably came from military experiments using parachute test dummies. But still, many people weren't convinced. Now, over the years, other wild theories have popped up, one coming from a book saying that the crash was part of a Soviet plot. According to this theory, Stalin had used Nazi scientists to create alien-looking children and sent them in a strange craft to scare the US into thinking it was an alien invasion. However, many dismissed this as it was really unlikely. Jesse Marcel Jr., the son of the officer who originally handled the debris, added to the debate. Marcel Jr. said his father brought some of the material home before turning it over to the base. He described it as metallic, lightweight, and covered in strange symbols, which he thought looked like geometric shapes. Some suggest he might have mistaken the Soviet Cyrillic alphabet for alien symbols. The Greys. The Greys are often depicted as humanoid creatures with slender bodies, large heads, and distinct almond-shaped black eyes. While some display them as neutral or even peaceful, there are many reports that describe Greys in a more menacing manner, frequently linked to hostile encounters and invasive abduction reports. Greys are commonly associated with theories about genetic experimentation and hybridization. Stories often say that these beings have an interest in human genetics, abducting individuals to perform medical experiments or to harvest genetic material. One theory says that the Greys are a dying species and are unable to reproduce on their own, and instead are using human DNA to create hybrids in an attempt to ensure their survival. Some believe this crossbreeding agenda might explain their interest in humans, but these theories remain unproven. In addition to these abductions, Greys are also linked to strange phenomena such as cattle mutilation. Researchers propose that their experiments extend to animals, using them to study Earth's biosphere or to develop biological resources. Now, whether these theories have any basis in reality still remains unknown. Some abduction stories suggest they possessed psychic abilities, which they used to calm or pacify abductees during their procedures. However though, this behavior is debated, While some interpret it as evidence of a softer side, others still argue it's purely practical and meant to keep the victims docile during experiments. The Greys' lack of empathy and their clinical approach to interactions leaves them in the light of fear and suspicion. Now, there is also a distinction between smaller and taller Greys. The smaller ones are often described as subordinate to the taller ones, who are perceived as more sinister and emotionless. Alien spores. A strange event occurred in the small Alaskan village of Kivalina when an orange substance appeared in large quantities along the shore, in freshwater rivers, and even on rooftops. They were identified as millions of microscopic eggs filled with fatty droplets. Janet Mitchell, who is Kivalina City's administrator, described the eggs as having different textures and odors depending on where they were found. When collected from the ocean, the substance was light, slippery, and resembled baby oil with no noticeable odor. However, eggs that were discovered further inland along the Woolwich River turned to be gooey and gave off a very gaseous smell. This unusual material was found not only on the ground, but also in rainwater buckets and on rooftops, spreading across the village. Franz Douglas, who lived in Kivalina for an extended period of time, noted that the eggs streaked through the Woolwich River and the nearby lagoon, which spans half a mile wide and 6 miles long. Reports of similar orange-tinged water extended to Buckland, which is a village 150 miles away. Douglas said that climate change might have played a role, pointing out that Kivalina's temperatures have become noticeably warmer over her lifetime. She estimated that the volume of eggs present in the area could have exceeded 1,000 gallons. Despite their eventual disappearance though, concerns have lingered about the long-term effects these eggs might have had on Kivalina's delicate ecosystem and food supply. The village relies heavily on subsistence living, making its residents especially sensitive to changes in the environment. Mitchell stated that while the eggs were no longer visible, their microscopic size might mean they still lingered in the water. Now, to add to this mystery, villagers reported a mass die-off of minnows in the lagoon shortly after the eggs appeared. Scientists questioned whether the eggs themselves were toxic or if their sheer volume had depleted oxygen in the water, which suffocated the fish. NOAA scientist G. Bryce confirmed that the material was biological, identifying the eggs as belonging to a small invertebrate species, but the exact type remains unclear though. The sudden emergence of these eggs baffled villagers who had no prior experience with such a phenomenon. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, NOAA, collected samples for further analysis and sent them to specialized laboratories, including the University of Alaska Fairbanks. There have been similar anomalies, including the red rain that fell in Kerala, India in 2001, and reports of star jelly, which is a gelatinous substance that occasionally can be found after meteor showers or rainstorms. These biological phenomena remain unexplained and still lead to curiosity. Later in March 2012, it was announced that the orange material in Kivalina had been identified as a mix of crustacean eggs and spruce Labrador tea needle rust, which is a fungal infection. Flatwoods Monster. On September 12, 1952, 4 boys named Edward and Freddie May, Neil Nunley, and Tommy Heyer were playing on the lawn of Flatwoods Elementary School in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia. Out of nowhere, a bright light streaked across the sky and seemed to crash into a hillside on a nearby farm owned by G. Bailey Fisher. The boys were curious and excited and went to investigate. On the way, they stopped at the May family home to tell their mother, Kathleen May, about what they had seen. Kathleen, who was intrigued and concerned, told Eugene Lemon and their dog Richie to join the group as they headed toward the crash site. When they arrived, they spotted a strange red light coming from the hillside. Lemon aimed his flashlight toward the source of the glow, showing a very terrifying figure. The group described seeing a 10-foot tall creature with a head shape of a spade and a metallic body resembling a dark dress. Its hands were clawed and twisted, and its glowing orange eyes emitted a strange aura. The creature seemed to hover above the ground, covered in a thick, nauseating mist. Without warning, the creature hissed and glided toward them. They were overwhelmed by fear and turned back and ran away. Following the encounter, some members of the group experienced symptoms such as throat irritation, nausea, and vomiting. While these symptoms were related to the hysteria by some, others said that these symptoms are consistent with exposure to mustard gas or maybe to another chemical. This incident was reported to local authorities that night. There was a search of that area, but nothing unusual was found. Now, this wasn't the only reported sighting of a similar creature in the area. Days earlier, Audra Harper, who was a resident near the town of Heaters, about 5 miles from Flatwoods, also stated a strange experience. While walking through the woods with a friend, Harper saw what she first assumed was a fire on a hillside, possibly a neighbor chasing foxes. However, when she glanced back, the fire had disappeared, replaced with the silhouette of a tall, dark humanoid figure. Terrified, Harper and her friend ran through the rocky terrain until they reached a safe place. The following day, on September 13, another sighting was reported near Strange Creek, about 20 miles south of Flatwoods. George and Edith Snitowski, along with their 18-month-old son, were driving on a rural stretch on Route 4 when their car suddenly stalled. As they sat in darkness trying to figure out what to do, a foul sulfuric odor filled the air, and their child began to cry. A bright light illuminated the area, and a 10-foot-tall creature appeared in front of their car. This time, the creature lacked the spade-shaped body described in the Flatwoods encounter though. Instead, its head was reptilian and bony, with clawed hands that it dragged across the car's hood before running into the woods. As soon as the creature vanished, the car started up again, and the family fled. Also 1. On October 25, 1974, Carl Higdon, a 40-year-old oil well driller, experienced what he said was an extraterrestrial encounter while hunting elk in Medicine Bow National Park, which is a remote area 40 miles south of his home in Rawlins, Wyoming. Higdon, who's a husband and father of 4, had taken the day off to enjoy a solitary hunting trip, but the events of the day would turn into something much more than ordinary. As Higdon moved through the park, he came across a group of elk. Spotting a large male, he silently raised his rifle, which was a Magnum, and carefully lined up his shot. When he pulled the trigger, the expected recoil from the weapon never came though. Now, to his surprise, the detonation was completely silent. Higdon claimed he watched the bullet leave the barrel in slow motion, traveling so slowly that it seemed to spin an invisible, jelly-like substance. The bullet never reached its target, and Higdon's confusion turned into fear. As he tried to make sense of what had just happened, a strange being emerged and approached him. The figure was humanoid in shape, but entirely alien in appearance, with features that defied normal human anatomy. The being identified itself as Also One and greeted Higdon casually, asking "How you doing?" Now, despite his fear, Higdon managed to respond weakly, saying "Pretty good." The alien even asked if he was hungry, and without waiting for a reply, sent a small, clear package containing 4 pills floating toward him. The pills were odd and unfamiliar, but Higdon would later claim that Also One explained their purpose. They could sustain a person for an extended period of time without the need of food. Higdon was fearful, but also intrigued, as he became aware of a strange cube-like object behind the alien. The craft gleamed in the sunlight, and its unusual shape immediately caught his attention. He sensed Higdon's curiosity, and asked him, "Do you want to come along?" Now, Higdon shrugged his shoulders in agreement. What happened next was a blur of time and memory for Higdon. His next clear memory was of being inside the cube-like craft. While the details of how he entered or what occurred immediately after were hazy though, Higdon claimed that he was given a tour of Also One's home planet. The specifics of this journey are pretty vague, but are vivid for Higdon, who later described the experience as surreal. The encounter was later stated as the Also One sighting. While some say his report is just an elaborate hoax or a hallucination brought on by stress or just environmental factors, others found his detailed and unusual descriptions difficult to dismiss. Tier 2. The Phoenix Lights. On the evening of March 13, 1997, thousands of people in Arizona, Nevada, and even parts of northern Mexico witnessed a series of mysterious lights in the sky. The lights made a V-shaped form which moved steadily and silently, leaving viewers baffled and curious about where this is originating from. The sightings happened in 2 main phases. The first one happened around 7:30 to 8:45 p.m. when witnesses described a formation of lights moving southward across Arizona toward Tucson. Some said the lights were individual orbs, while others thought that they were attached to a single, massive object that blocked out the stars. Now the second phase is the one that's more sighted later that night, which was between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Over Phoenix, residents observed a massive V-shaped formation of lights that seemed to hover or glide silently. Some witnesses captured video footage of the lights, which seemed too uniform and precise to just be a random occurrence. In response to this, the US Air Force issued a statement saying that the lights were flares dropped by an A-10 Warthog aircraft during a training exercise at the Barry M. Goldwater Range in southwestern Arizona. According to the Air Force, the flares created the illusion of a large, structured object as they descended. While this explanation seemed satisfactory at the time, there are still witnesses and researchers that didn't really believe it. Witnesses pointed out that the lights moved in ways that are inconsistent with flares, which typically drift randomly and go out within minutes. Now, the lights that were observed over Phoenix maintained their formation for a longer period of time and moved deliberately and made no sound. This silent behavior led majority to believe that the lights were attached to a large craft or were part of a highly advanced type of technology. The actor Kurt Russell, who was a private pilot, later came forward as a witness, saying that he saw the lights while flying into Phoenix on that evening. He believed it to be a UFO. There have been scientists and skeptics that offered other explanations as well, suggesting the lights might have been a misidentification of some type of aircraft, a celestial phenomena, or even just mass hysteria. The University of Arizona has an astronomer by the name Christopher Impey that said that some of the sightings might have involved an A-10 aircraft in a formation or flare activity, which created some type of optical illusion when it was viewed over a long distance. However, there are credible witnesses with consistent descriptions that don't align with flares or any conventional aircraft like the A-10. Rendlesham Forest Incident. On December 26, 1980, there was a series of events that occurred in Rendlesham Forest, which is located between the twin US Air Force bases of Woodbridge and Bentwaters in southern England. The incident began with Airman First Class John Burroughs on patrol at Woodbridge Air Base, and he noticed an unusual bright light coming from the nearby forest. He was joined by his partner and reported the sighting to their superior and another security patrol that confirmed the presence of strange lights. They both went beyond American jurisdiction without weapons. Now, as they went into the woods, the group noticed that the animals in the area were pretty agitated. They received a radio transmission saying that Heathrow Tower in London had detected an object over the base that disappeared shortly after. When they reached the source of the light, they encountered a strange object with blue strobing lights that went through the trees and into the sky. The group described feeling as though time slowed down and reality seemed distorted during the sighting. Now, over the next 2 hours, the object kept moving closer and farther away from the horizon. A few hours later, Burroughs relayed the incident to his post commander, who told him to search the area for any physical evidence. At the site, they found unusual ground marks in a perfect triangle and burn marks on nearby trees. A local police officer who accompanied them dismissed the ground marks as burrowing animals, but the symmetry of the markings was pretty weird. The next morning, Colonel Charles Hull, who was the deputy base commander, was informed of the sightings. At first, he was pretty skeptical, but he started an investigation and was surprised by the consistency of the reports. That same evening, there were more lights being reported and led to the setup of floodlights in the forest. When these lights malfunctioned, Holt decided to lead a team into the woods, armed with a tape recorder and other equipment, and this included a professional photographer. In the forest, Holt's team identified a landing site where they used instruments to take readings on the trees. Now, out of nowhere, they noticed a red, glowing object zigzagging through the trees. It moved in some weird patterns and eventually split into 5 smaller white orbs before they disappeared. The group then saw a farmhouse that appeared to glow as if it was on fire, but the source of the glow still couldn't be found. Now, they continued their investigation, and the men saw 3 more objects in the sky performing some weird movements. There were beams of lights emanating from the objects, and there were other witnesses on the base that also confirmed seeing these lights. Now, John Burroughs reported waking up during the second wave of activity, and he witnessed the blue, transparent lights in the sky, and one of them descended and passed through some truck, and then went back into the sky. At the same time, Holt's team saw an object moving toward them at very high speeds, emitting a beam of light, which came close to where they were standing before vanishing again. The following day, Holt shared a recording of the night's events with his superior, who told him to file an incident report. The report and tape were sent up the chain of command, but confusion was still there, and the British military authorities didn't take much action. Later on in 1983, the incident gained more public attention when a private citizen obtained the report through a Freedom of Information Act request. Astronomer James McGaha argues that the sightings were likely just misinterpretations of a meteor shower, or even just reflections from some lighthouse. McGaha suggested that there are psychological factors such as hysteria and expectation which may have influenced the witnesses' perceptions. But Burroughs and others strongly decline these claims, saying that meteors don't behave in erratic manners, and nor do they move up and down through a forest. Colonel Halt also dismissed the lighthouse theory, saying that lights were seen in multiple locations and moved in an inconsistent manner. Later on, there were more sightings reported near Woodbridge. In total, there were at least 15 individuals that claimed to have witnessed this strange phenomena. The Tran UFO Incident. On September 19, 1976, the Tran UFO Incident occurred and involved visual sightings, radar confirmations, and even electronic malfunctions, which were experienced by two Iranian Air Force F-4 Phantom jets. The encounter began on September 18, 1976, when air traffic controller Hossein Perozi at Mehrabad International Airport received calls from local citizens stating a luminous object is in the sky. Witnesses reported a glowing red, yellow, and orange object that appeared to split into two before reuniting in the sky. Peruzzi steps outside with binoculars since he didn't have an operational radar and observed the object himself. It was seen as a cylindrical shape with glowing blue ends and a rotating red light. Over time, it seemed to change shape, becoming star-like with four arms and changing colors. The object moved erratically through the sky and sometimes disappearing and reappearing again farther away. Brigadier General Nader Yousufi viewed the object from his home in northern Tehran, confirming its presence, and ordered an F-4 Phantom jet from Sharoki Air Force Base to investigate. The first pilot, Yadi Naziri, saw the object from over 100 kilometers away, saying it was very bright and radiating colors such as violet, orange, and just white. As he approached, the UFO kept moving away and outpacing his aircraft, even at Mach 2 speeds. When he attempted to close in, his communications and navigational system failed, only resorting to functionality when he retreated. At one point though, another object appeared to fly past him and returned to the main craft faster than he could. There was a second F-4, which was piloted by Lieutenant Parviz Jafari and scrambled at 1:40 a.m. Jafari's radar operator was able to lock onto the UFO, which appeared as large as a Boeing 707. Jafari reported the object flashing blue, green, red, and orange lights in a very fast sequence, with a diamond-shaped structure at its core. As he was approaching it, a smaller object detached from the UFO and moved quickly toward his jet. He prepared for engagement, but Jafari found that his weapon systems and communications had somehow failed. Now, trying to quickly maneuver out of the situation, he performed a dive during which the smaller object retracted and rejoined to the larger craft. As he continued to monitor the UFO, there was another small object emerging and descending to the ground. It also emitted an intense light that illuminated a large area. There were attempts to investigate this landing site, but weren't possible due to equipment malfunctions. Witnesses, including Peruzzi, confirmed seeing the smaller object go down and the main craft still hovering high above. Shortly after, the larger UFO ascended again and quickly disappeared. Now, at sunrise, there was a helicopter team that dispatched to search the area where the smaller object had tried to land. But there was no physical evidence, even though locals reported hearing loud noises and seeing a bright light during the night. Pilots and ground personnel also reported hearing a strange, high-pitched beeping sound near the site. Now, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, created a report based on interviews with Iranian pilots and personnel. The report was distributed to the White House, CIA, NSA, and other agencies, describing this as a very credible encounter. Now, skeptics proposed alternative explanations, such as satellite re-entry or just a possibility of a bright star. But these theories failed to account for the reported radar lock, physical effects on the aircraft, on the object's maneuvers. A UFO debunker named Philip Glass argued that the pilots had been chasing celestial objects or were just misled by phenomena. But these explanations were undermined by the detailed accounts of many witnesses. Also, investigators including Bruce Maccabee, who's an optical physicist, looked over the evidence and said that the object displayed capabilities beyond what we currently have. Aerial school sighting. In September 1994, in Rwanda, Zimbabwe, over 60 kids in school aged between 6 and 12 reported witnessing an unidentified craft that landed in a field that was near their school. The children described seeing one or more humanoid figures from the craft. Dr. John E. Mack traveled to Zimbabwe shortly after this event to interview the children directly. He was shocked by the consistency of their stories and their detailed descriptions of the craft and the beings they encountered. Mac said that the children were recounting an event grounded in physical reality, saying that their stories were consistent, and the way they talked about it left basically no questions in our minds that what happened was just about what they said happened. His public belief in the children's testimonies with his early research into alien abduction led to some scrutiny from his peers at Harvard. The university launched a confidential investigation into his clinical methods. Despite this though, Mac continued with his belief that the children's accounts deserves some serious attention. The children's accounts remained consistent over years. They described the beings as small, with large heads and black almond-shaped eyes. Some of the children claimed that they received telepathic messages warning about environmental destruction and the future of humanity. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction. In September 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were returning home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire after a delayed honeymoon trip to Montreal and Niagara Falls when they encountered a strange event. The couple were driving through the White Mountains during a late night and they noticed an unusual light in the sky. This light followed them as they drove, becoming brighter and more persistent with each passing mile, which soon turned into a series of events that neither Betty or Barney actually comprehend. The Hills were a hard-working couple, deeply involved with their community. Betty, a social worker handling child welfare cases, and then Barney, who was a postal worker and World War II veteran, who also volunteered for civil rights causes through their church and the NAACP. They were an interracial couple in the early 1960s, and they did not mind a challenge, but nothing could have prepared them for what occurred on the night of September 19, 1961. Around 10 p.m. that night, the Hills left a dinner in Vermont and planned to reach Portsmouth by 2 a.m. When they were driving through the remote roads of the White Mountains, they noticed a strange light in the sky. Barney, who was an experienced plane enthusiast, initially ignored it as a satellite or some aircraft, but later on, as the light seemed to follow their car, it disappeared behind trees only to reappear moments later, and this made them both uneasy. Betty, who was looking through a pair of binoculars, observed a spinning object in the sky, and she described it as a flying saucer. Barney couldn't explain what he was seeing either. As they were getting closer to Lincoln, New Hampshire, the object descended and hovered just 100 feet above their car. Barney then stopped the car and stepped out with a gun and observed a massive craft which looked like a flat disc with windows revealing humanoid figures in gray uniforms. The beings inside seemed to talk to each other telepathically, telling Barney to lower his binoculars. He then attempted to raise his pistol, but found himself unable to move. He was terrified and ran back to the car when the couple sped away. Not too long after, they heard strange beeping noises from the trunk and felt an overwhelming sense of drowsiness and became unconscious. The next day, the Hills woke up in their home in Portsmouth, no memory of how they arrived. There were details that began to emerge in their memory. Barney's shoes were scuffed, Betty's dress was torn, and both their watches had stopped. The couple was confused and tried to piece together what had happened. Betty began researching UFO phenomena, filing a report with the Air Force, and even seeking information from the NICAP, which is a UFO investigation group. She was also worried about radiation exposure. Now, in the following months, both Betty and Barney experienced disturbing dreams and anxiety, making them want to seek help from a psychiatrist named Dr. Benjamin Simon. Through hypnosis appointments, Dr. Simon helped the Hills uncover repressed memories of their encounter. They recalled being taken aboard an aircraft where they were separated and were put through medical examinations. They described beings that were small, with gray skin and large black eyes that took samples of their hair, nails, and skin. Betty also said a needle was inserted into her stomach and was told that it was a pregnancy test. During these examinations, Betty described one of them as a leader who observed the procedures. In one of the conversations with this leader, Betty asked about the origins of their craft, and then later on, in her hypnosis, she drew a map of a star system that she claimed the beings had shown her. Now, many years later, an astronomer named Marjorie Fish analyzed Betty's map and identified it as resembling the Zeta Reticuli star system. Travis Walton abduction. On November 5, 1975, Travis Walton, who's a 22-year-old logger from Snowflake, Arizona, vanished out of nowhere. While returning home with 6 coworkers after a long day of work in Sitgreaves National Park, Walton and his crew noticed an unusual yellow light glowing through the trees. As they approached, they saw what appeared to be a saucer-like object in the forest. He ignored the warnings from his coworkers and got out of the truck to get a closer look. According to his account, he got near the object and a bolt of blue light shot out and struck him and pushed him backward. His coworkers panicked and drove away and left him behind. When they came up with the courage to return a few minutes later, Walton was already gone. Over the next week, he was nowhere to be found. The local law enforcement initially thought Walton's coworkers had concocted the UFO story to cover up a possible murder. But a week after his disappearance, he reappeared in Arizona, disoriented and with a weird story. He claimed that he had been taken aboard an alien craft and put through a series of medical examinations by beings he described as small, humanoid figures. He then stated that he woke up on a table surrounded by these creatures before being placed into another room. In this second space, he encountered more figures who were less alien in appearance and wore helmets. Walton described the environment as sterile and disorienting, and he believed that he had been used for some kind of experiment. This incident gained attention with the media when his story was featured in a 1978 autobiography titled The Walton Experience. Now, there was skepticism about his story as there were more details emerging. A UFO debunker known by the name Philip J. Glass conducted an extensive investigation into the case. He pointed out that Walton's family had a history of interest in UFOs and claimed that he had seen a television movie about an abduction just weeks before his disappearance. He also said that there might have been financial motives, noting that Walton's logging crew was behind on schedule on their contract and may have used the incident to gain some type of financial relief. There were further doubts regarding his polygraph tests. While initially polygraph tests were funded by the National Enquirer that supported his story, there were more tests showing inconsistent results as well. It was noted that the case incentivized Walton to stick to his narrative, as he would receive $5,000 as a prize from the National Enquirer for the best UFO story of the year. Despite all this skepticism, Walton stuck by his experience. Walton also admitted that the abduction had brought unwanted attention and described how it disrupted his life for years coming. The Pascagoula Abduction. On October 11, 1973, it was a late evening when 2 men from Pascagoula, Mississippi, named Charles Hickson, who was 42 years old, and Calvin Parker Jr., only 19 years old, were rushed into the local sheriff's department in a very shocked state. The men claimed they had been abducted by aliens when they were fishing along the Pascagoula River, and both had puncture wounds on one arm. Despite the initial skepticism from the authorities, the men passed their polygraph tests and maintained their story for many years to come. Hickson was Parker's foreman at a local shipyard, and the two had gone to a secluded boat launch after work for a quiet evening to fish. As the sun set, they were startled by a sudden zipping sound and a flashing blue light. Looking up, they saw a 30-foot long craft with a dome hovering just above the ground. From the craft, there were 3 strange creatures that came out, each floating instead of just walking. Hickson described the beings as humanoid but still otherworldly, with wrinkled, grayish skin and claw-like pincers instead of hands. Parker would later state that he was paralyzed as the creatures grabbed them and levitated them into the craft. Inside, Hickson said he was subjected to a bizarre examination by what he said was a mechanical giant eye that kept emitting a buzzing sound. Parker, who was overwhelmed with fear, at first said that he fainted, but later on admitted he was still conscious throughout the whole encounter. After the apparent examination, the men were returned to the riverbank and left standing in the dark as though nothing had happened. Hickson found Parker in a very shocked state, and his arms were raised towards the sky and screaming out loud. They immediately went out to look for help, driving to the Jackson County Sheriff Department to report what they had experienced. The sheriff's investigators didn't really believe what they had to say, and initially suspected the men of just being drunk or making up a story. So, in order to test their credibility, the officers secretly recorded the pair after leaving them alone in the interrogation room, hoping to catch some lies. Instead, the recording captured the men continuing to express the fear and confusion they did in front of them. There were crowds who came over to the small Mississippi town, with some donning tinfoil hats and camping by the rivers in hopes of encountering some extraterrestrial beings. Hickson, who was already a well-known person in the community, liked the intention and shared his story with the reporters and appeared on shows like The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Later on in 1983, he even published a book about the encounter. On the other hand, Parker struggled deeply with this. He was just a teenager and he wanted nothing to do with the media. Consumed by the fear that he'd contaminated by radiation, he admitted to bathing in bleach when he got home that night. Shortly after, he left Pascagoula, moving from job to job to avoid recognition. And for decades, he avoided talking about the encounter publicly. Now, later on, Parker published his own book in 2018 and shared his full story. And there was even one witness, Maria Blair, who described the sighting as vividly real and admitted she had kept silent for 45 years out of fear of being ridiculed.